Hi, my name is Laura, and I want to welcome you to C464, Introduction to Communication. In this video, we will be talking about the two communication models. First, I will explain about the components of any communication event. Second, I will go over the linear model of communication. Third, I will explain the transactional model of communication. We hope that this video will help you better understand the basic models of communication, but make sure you also read about them in your learning resource to get a full understanding. Any communication model needs some basic components. The first component is that there must be two people, or two human groups. In this scene, we have a doctor communicating with a patient, but the two human groups could be one company communicating to another company, or a company communicating to all its customers. In other words, there must be both a sender of the message and someone or a group who is the receiver of the message. Whether that sender and receiver are just one person or a whole group of people on one end or the other will vary from situation to situation. In the scene here, if the doctor is saying something to the patient and the patient is listening, then the doctor is the sender and the patient is the receiver. What the doctor says is called the message. The way the message gets to the receiver, the patient in this case, is called the channel. When people are face to face like this, the channel is simply the air between them. If they were on the phone, then the phone lines would be the channel. Before the sender sends their message to the receiver, they first need to encode their message. In other words, they think about what message do I want to send and how should I word it. Yes, with everything we say, we are encoding our messages. No, we may not even realize that we are doing it because it can go so fast. But in other instances, we might carefully encode our message. For instance, here, the doctor is very carefully encoding what he wants to say to Marilyn, his patient. So he decides how to word the message, and then he decides what channel to use to send the message. Perhaps he's thinking about an email or a phone call, or maybe a face-to-face visit. So, the doctor decided on a face-to-face channel to discuss Marilyn's test results. He tells her what he encoded earlier. As the receiver of this message, Marilyn then begins to decode what the doctor is saying. In other words, she is interpreting his message and creating her own meaning from it. While the doctor has not said as much, she interprets or decodes that the test results are not serious. Marilyn's decoding of the message takes into mind not only the words the doctor says, but the way he says them and his other nonverbal actions. Let's recap what we have learned so far. The components of communication include a sender as component 1. Component 2 is that the sender encodes what they want to communicate. Component 3 is the actual message the sender encoded. Component 4 is the channel used to convey the message. Component 5 is the receiver who gets the message. Then Component 6 is the decoding process that the receiver goes through to interpret the message. There is a seventh component that we have not yet talked about. That component is noise. Noise is anything that interferes with a message successfully getting from the sender to the receiver. That could be an actual noise, such as a child crying loudly, thus we can't quite hear what the sender said. But it could also be our own preconceived notions that get in the way of proper decoding. Or it could be that the sender has put too much information and is overwhelming the receiver. You will learn much more about noise in Module 11, which discusses listening barriers. The scenario with the doctor and patient has so far been what we would consider a linear model. Back when people first began to study communication, they determined those 7 components from the previous slide and saw communication as a one-way movement. Messages went from sender to receiver, and then the communication event was done. As our learning resource tells us, there are 5 phases to the linear model. In phase 1, the sender decides the message, decides they are going to send a message. In phase 2 is when the sender encodes the message. Phase 3 is where the sender actually transmits the message through a channel. The last 2 phases then move to the receiver. In phase 4, the receiver perceives that they are receiving a message. And finally, in phase 5, the receiver decodes or assigns meaning to the message. While the linear model does introduce us to all those important components, in reality, this one-way process is not how communication actually happens. This is why people who were studying communication came up with what we call the transactional model. The transactional model adds 2 new components to the linear model to make the model more of a back and forth event. In the transactional model, it allows for feedback from the receiver back to the sender. So that first new component is feedback. As the doctor tells Marilyn about her test results, she is not just sitting there blankly, she has many different nonverbal facial reactions to what he is saying. These nonverbal reactions are just as much feedback as if she had verbally said something back to him. In fact, as he begins speaking, Marilyn starts sending feedback nonverbally to him right away, so her communicative feedback is happening simultaneously with the message the doctor is stating. This is why the back and forth arrow is the best way to describe what happens between sender and receiver. The second component that is added to the transactional model is context. Context refers to the environment or situation in which the communication occurs. The context helps the communicators determine how to communicate. As your reading states, every context has a set of prescribed roles and rules. The environment here, of course, is a doctor's office. That environment, or context, usually means a little more formal style of communication takes place. For instance, we use the term doctor as a title instead of calling the doctor by his or her first name. In this particular case, the situation is that the doctor has test results to talk about, so that might mean he is more serious than if it was just a regular yearly checkup. So that situation, that context, may mean he speaks more carefully, more quietly than he might otherwise. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch this video. I hope that watching this helped you to understand and remember, first, the initial 7 components of communication, then how those components work in the linear model, finally, how 2 more components are added to then complete the transactional model. I hope you enjoy the rest of your studies in C464, Introduction to Communication. Goodbye.